I've been trained as an experimental psychologist, so as the name suggests, we're in the business of gathering data from experiments, and I engage in technical report writing. And primarily, the writing is governed by the style manual of the American Psychological Association. The last journal article that I completed was a multi-experiment paper, and we find typically in the sciences such as psychology that journals are looking for multi-experiment papers because typically a single experiment report opens up more questions than it answers. So with multiple experiment reports, we're more likely to arrive at a definitive analysis with regard to a theory or a set of hypotheses. So the last paper I completed for a journal was a multiple experiment paper. It was written according to the APA style format, and as with all of my papers, it was a multiple authorship and a collaboration across many of my colleagues as well as students. Ideas for journal articles and experiments always come from the literature as well as discussions with my colleagues. The fact is that no idea ever blossoms in a vacuum. We always work with the literature, we work with the discipline, and a good part of sound scholarship and research is that you're familiar with the literature base. Typically, multiple experiment papers take 3 or 4 years. So if we begin with the inception of the idea, and that generally involves lots of discussion in lab groups along with students and colleagues, to the genesis of some hypotheses that are testable, and then through the data gathering phase, the analysis and interpretation, we're looking at 3 or 4 years. And throughout that process, I should point out, because science is a social enterprise, the fact is that many different eyes, many hands touch that manuscript. So after 3 or 4 years, it's not uncommon for a manuscript to have been revised 10, 12, or even 15 times. And this is before it even gets to the editor of a journal. It should be loaded up with citations, which means that we are standing on the shoulders of scholars and researchers who have gathered data before us. This is referred to as intertextuality. The fact is that the report, the text, the narrative that we are completing as far as our experimental write-up really began with the thoughts, the research, the findings of others. When I'm engaged in the revision process, this usually involves my colleagues because, as I said, in psychology, we're almost always writing multiple authorship papers. So the revision will occur among a group of us, and it usually begins with a number of discussions in which we consider what paragraphs need to be refined or what sections need to be revised or deleted. Then I will, for instance, take a crack at it. I will try to tweak the manuscript in the manner that was discussed, and then it goes into the hands of another author. That author, the co-author, would then take a look at the manuscript and see if further revisions are needed. That the sciences are social enterprises. They require the collaboration of a lot of good thinkers and team players in order to bring a research project to closure and at that point publish something. Where the disciplines differ is in terms of their methodology, in terms of how they gather information. Many times the questions are the same. They're shared, they're universal, they're fundamental across disciplines. But the way in which those questions are answered can differ based on discipline. So the research methodology and the statistics applied by psychologists will be different than sociologists or biologists. And this leads us back to how scientists communicate in their writing, and ultimately that is the technical writing and the style requirements that are adhered to by that discipline. No one is born to naturally write technical writing. The fact is that it takes a great deal of practice, and this is where revise and resubmits become so important for the student. The idea that you can simply craft a single draft and that will be acceptable, at least in the sciences, is not going to be the case. Many revisions and resubmits are required for a finished piece. So essentially, a great deal, in terms of my own writing, a great deal of thought and incubation goes into the process before I even sit down at a keyboard. And by that I mean it could take days, weeks, occasionally months for me to think about an idea, how to cast that, how to consider the audience before I actually sit down at the keyboard and start to hammer out the first paragraph. For an author to revise his or her own work is a requirement in all good scientific writing, that is technical writing, but I would also say one of the most difficult requirements. The fact is that authors typically cherish their words, and every word written down becomes a part of something that the writer would like to see established forever. But we know that in reality, that's not the case. Others are going to look at the manuscript and have their own, perhaps better ideas as far as how the narrative should flow. And of course, editors have the final say. So if an editor says, look, I like your article, I like your work, but you're going to have to cut 15 or 20%. That's probably one of the most difficult tasks for an author to engage in, and yet that is a necessary requirement in order to get published. And let me mention one other aspect about publication. And even presenting one's scientific findings at a professional conference. My faculty, when I was a student, always told us that in order to be science, it needs to be public. And I took that very seriously. What that meant is, yes, one can go about devising an experiment, gathering data, and coming up with some very interesting results. But unless you get those results out there, that is public, in the form of a journal article or presentation at a conference, it isn't yet science because your colleagues have not had an opportunity to view your work, to evaluate your research, and to perhaps attempt a replication. I think all authors have a fear of having writer's block or getting stuck, and even folks who have been at it for a long time, such as myself, will come up to a point where I just can't think of what I should be writing next. And in fact, I think many times, especially for beginning writers, that writer's block occurs at the very start of a project. You're looking at the blank screen or blank sheet of paper, and it's daunting. It's intimidating to come up with something that you'll know will be accepted, will be readable by either a faculty member or a colleague. What I attempt to do is just to put my thoughts down, even if they're not yet formed completely, and certainly they're not going to be in polished form, but at least get the words down on paper and just drive myself through the first paragraph or two, and then come back to it in a day or so. And the reason why I think that's a good technique to follow is that it's always easier to revise than it is to come up with an original narrative. So later on, the next day or a week later, if you're looking at those initial paragraphs, you might decide, gosh, I have a good idea. Those are good ideas, but I have a better way of expressing that now. Or maybe you've decided, I'm going to scratch those two paragraphs because in the meantime, I've come up with something better. For me to write well, I need to be disciplined. And by that, I mean I need to set aside time. I actually need to schedule blocks of time, hours and days, in which I can devote myself wholeheartedly to a project. I'm not one of those individuals who can write at the spur of the moment, and as thoughts come into my head, I can jot them down, and that will form a coherent narrative later on. I find that what works best for me in terms of practice is by blocking some time, scheduling some hours in which I know I won't be disturbed, and then sitting down at the keyboard and working through that solid block of time. I'm a early bird, which means that if I can find time between maybe 6 and 8, 6 or 9 in the morning, I know that sounds painful for some of you, but if it's really early in the morning, I find I get a lot of work done because there are no distractions. Everyone else is sleeping.